My name is Annika Todd, and I just want to welcome you all to the second in our ongoing webinar series titled Uses for Smart Meter Data. And thanks for joining us today. So in our last webinar, what we did was basically show that utilities can apply some simple analytic techniques to their smart meter data so that they can learn more about their customers and how their customers would impact the grid. And in addition, we illustrated that these activities can enable utilities to identify which customers might be good candidates for certain rate or program offerings and which customers you might want to avoid providing such opportunities, and which customers might need some more dedicated and targeting education and outreach to increase the likelihood of their success, give them some tips and stuff like that. And so that was our last one. And so today, Pete Kappers is going to identify some of the more advanced analytical techniques that can be applied to further refine a utility's understanding of its customers and assess who might be more viable candidates to participate in some of the rate or program offerings. And I just want to emphasize at this point, it's definitely not, this is a standalone presentation, so it's definitely not necessary to have heard the first one. But the first few slides will go over that, and if you want more details, you can go back to that one. And so just as a very short background, Pete and I are both economists, and we have been working together for I think 8 years, which is super exciting for me. Our research, along with some others in our research group, we focus on how people make energy decisions, and specifically, we look at how people actually use energy as opposed to what traditional sort of economic and engineering models say that people should do if they are always perfectly quote unquote rational every second of every day. So, and you might be interested to know, but not at all surprised, that not everybody uses electricity in the same way, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about over this webinar series we talked about last time, and this time is like everybody uses energy and electricity in different ways, and how do we sort of deal with that? So before Pete kicks things off for this round, we want to thank the Department of Energy for their financial support of this webinar series, because really without them we wouldn't have been able to make this happen, and we also wouldn't have jobs, so that's good. And so if you guys have questions, the thing to do is at the end of the webinar we're going to have a question and answer session, and we have all of you muted because otherwise somebody's going to have a dog barking in the background. But what you should do is like write down whatever questions you have in the sort of like chat window as you think of them during the presentation, and then I'm going to sort of sort them into things, and we're going to do our best to get to all of them at the end, except for we probably won't be able to get to all of them at the end, but we can follow up at a later time. So that's it for the introductory remarks, and Pete, on to you.
All right. Thanks, Annika. Appreciate it. Okay. So as Annika said, I think it's probably best for us to just give a little bit more robust of a recap of the first webinar. As she mentioned, although this one really expands upon some themes we previously discussed for those of you who were here before, the two presentations are largely independent. So it's not really a big deal if you missed the last one. Maybe you fell asleep halfway through it because I'm not the most dynamic speaker. But if after this overview in the next couple slides you find yourself really yearning for more details about that first webinar, you can find both the recording of it and the deck itself on our website. I saw that Kristen has actually posted the direct link to it in the chat function, so you should be able to go find it readily if you're interested in it. So as we previously discussed, utilities have historically used a relatively small sample of residential customers with interval meters to represent the usage patterns of the entire rate class. This is mainly because, look, interval metering was really expensive up until a few years ago, and so it didn't warrant providing that technology to all of its customers. The resulting class average load shape wasn't at all intended to provide the utility with information about the diversity of load shapes. It was just there to give a reasonably accurate picture of how the average customer consumed electricity over time. Now, the introduction of AMI and the interval meter data that it captured allowed the utility to see that there was actually a real substantial amount of variety in load patterns across customers. But this variety can really become overwhelming to the point of being useless, as you can sort of see from this graphic. And so it may actually lead some people back to using this overall class average load shape rather than trying to leverage the richness of this actual AMI data. And so, we really need to strike a balance between thinking everyone is the same with a single load shape representing the entire class versus thinking every single customer is different. We really need to make some order out of this chaos and so we need to find some sort of commonness in this sea of diversity. And one approach is to segment load profiles based on data we have about, say, major end uses. Unfortunately, we know that most utilities neither rigorously nor really comprehensively collect that kind of data. In addition, data about simple ownership of an end use doesn't necessarily suggest consistent use of that across all customers. As we discussed in the first webinar, residential customers, a lot of them may own air conditioning, but they use it in very different ways. And so simply segmenting customers based on self-reported, let's say, AC ownership may fail to really adequately segment customers in a meaningful and useful way. In an ideal world, we would use much more readily accessible data on how people actually consume electricity to make customer groups and segments. When utilities deploy smart meters to everyone, then this interval electricity consumption data is collected from each and every customer. And that data can then serve as the foundation for a segmentation effort. We can develop archetypal energy personalities, which group households with sort of similar energy characteristics together, like you see here. Then we can actually categorize all of those various archetypal load shapes along two dimensions. The first focuses on when the maximum daily demand occurs, and the second looks at the number of local maximum demands. Such a simple approach to customer segmentation allows for a pretty broad assessment of which customers might be good or poor candidates to participate in some particular rate or program offering. However, what this approach really lacks is a method for identifying good, better, or best candidates for participation based on an assessment of how they might respond. For that, we would really need to apply much more rigorous and complex analytical techniques that focus on more specific characteristics directly associated with the load shapes themselves. In our research, we identified 9 characteristics that we thought could be used to meaningfully segment customers. And so in the next couple slides, we're going to explain what each of these 9 characteristics are and then focus on a subset of those characteristics that our analysis found to be the most useful for segmenting these households into different groups. So to help explain, we're going to start with a very simple example. This prototypical customer we have, household number 63, and their load shape on a particular day in the summertime. The first characteristic that we identified has to do with the customer's base load usage. And we characterize this as basically, or define this as the daily minimum electricity consumption. This base load really represents a household's electricity use that's not expected to change throughout the day. Accordingly, we can really think about it as usage which is wholly unavailable to be altered during specific hours in response to, say, a rate or a program offering. So this is like a refrigerator operation that can neither be manually or automatically controlled. Now clearly, you can undertake some energy efficiency investments to get a more efficient refrigerator, which might lower the level of base load usage. But the fact is it's really not controllable within the day in any way, shape, or form. The second characteristic is then what's sort of left over, the discretionary usage. We can think about this as predominantly representing things that people in a household turn on and off throughout the course of the day. Right? So this could include toasters and hair dryers in the morning, an air conditioner in the afternoon, an oven or dishwasher in the evening. And these are things that a household may be able to change in specific hours by either reducing their usage of them or simply shifting the time in which that thing is used. Alternatively, we can actually look at average total usage over specific blocks of hours within a day. Now, technically, this characteristic could focus on really any block of hours, but for our purposes here in segmenting customers for participation in a utility rate or program opportunity, an obvious block of hours to first examine would be those coincident with the system peak. Historically, popular wisdom has suggested that people who have higher coincident peak usage have the most potential to reduce it. Other hours that may be relevant, though, are those just before or just after the peak period. And the level in those hours may provide insights into, let's say, when people are home and thus able to change their usage by reducing or shifting it across hours. Up until now, we've looked at the load shape for a single household on a single day. Let's just say that day we're looking at is the third Wednesday in June. Now, if we still focus on just that one household, we can actually look beyond this one particular Wednesday to, say, a Thursday of that week, or even a Friday of that week. And in looking at this household's load shapes across those 3 different days, you'll notice that they're really quite different each and every day. And that leads us to our next characteristic, which is variability in the load shape across days. You could imagine that some households like this one have really different usage profiles and patterns across different days. For example, this household looks like it has a lot of variability, right? Wednesday has one distinct morning and one distinct evening peak. Thursday has 2 peaks within a really short period of time. And Friday has a pretty decent-sized peak that's building over the course of the day. One way to think about this is that the household really has a flexible schedule that varies day to day. But then there might be other households that are a lot less flexible, perhaps because, let's say, they have fairly set routines. For example, a household may be on a 9 to 5 work schedule, and so eat breakfast and dinner at the same time every day, have their AC thermostat program to turn on the same time every day, etc. These people would have very low variability in load shapes across days. Now, we think this is one of the most interesting of our characteristics. For the 5 previously discussed, we had pretty definite prior beliefs and ideas about what they might mean for a customer's response capability to a rate or program offering. However, before we started this research, we really had no prior belief whatsoever about whether low variability would lead to more or less potential for load reductions under a utility-offered rate or program. In fact, we actually spent a lot of time in a conference room over the phone discussing which way we thought it would go, with a lot of heated discussions about, with anecdotes from our own lives and what kind of schedules and routines we have, especially those of us who have kids. Anyway, back to the story. So if someone has a set routine, then they're going to have probably low load variability that might be unable to be changed much. As creatures of habit, that means they might find it really difficult to alter their routine, even with explicit recommendations from a utility and monetary incentives through rates or programs. But on the other hand, it might actually be easier for them to reduce usage by changing just a few small habits in their routine. Let's say running the dishwasher before bed or setting their AC thermostat to a degree or 2 lower or higher, So the assessment of how load shape variability impacts participation and performance could also really be affected by the type of rate or program we're talking about. For example, a TOU rate provides a really predictable daily price pattern, which could make it a whole lot easier for people to alter their habits, since a one-time change in routine is really all that's required. From that point forward, they have a new and different routine that would be in effect. Alternatively, something like a peak time rebate program that requires episodic changes in consumption may be a whole lot more difficult for these types of customers to adapt to. They must make some sort of temporary change in that routine on a single day, but then resort back to their old routines and habits thereafter. And again, that just might be too much for those types of customers to deal with. Now, at this point in the presentation, we don't really have sufficient insight as to know which direction these customers would go in. But in our third webinar, where we match these various load shape characteristics and with actual participation and response experiences to a time-based rate, we're going to see that the impact of variability is actually much more complex than we originally thought. More about that next time. So be sure to tune into our joyous voices of your favorite nerdy and yet so cool economists in 2 weeks. All right, so back to where we were. We got one more major type of characteristic, and so sticking with this concept of variability over time, we can create one final set of characteristics which focuses on how usage during specific hours of the day varies from one day to the next. So for example, we can see some pretty stark differences in this household's usage during coincident peak hours across the 3 days. And the same is really true for pre- and post-peak hours as well. As with variability of those load shapes over time, we also didn't really have a strong sense of how variability of electricity usage over time, especially in particular time periods, might impact a customer's ability to respond to a rate or program. Again, it wasn't really necessarily clear to us if less or more variability was going to be good or bad, but we certainly thought that both types of variability would be critically important characteristics for segmenting customers into similar types of groups. So with these 9 characteristics now defined, we can actually apply them to a data set of smart meter data collected over a period of time. This results in, for every single customer, a list of 9 calculated characteristics. And based on these characteristics, we can then cluster similar customers together. Once these customer clusters are found, the levels of the various characteristics can be assessed in order to see how they vary from group to group. So we applied this approach to smart meter data collected over the course of 2 consecutive summers from a group of residential customers of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. Our analysis found that there were 9 groups of customers who were statistically significantly different from each other based on these various load shape characteristics. In addition, we found that only 5 of the 9 load shape characteristics helped to meaningfully differentiate which of the 9 groups the households would be in. The fact that there are 9 resulting customer groups and 9 total load shape characteristics is completely coincidental. I want to be very clear about that. But the 5 load shape characteristics that ultimately were the most important in segmenting customers were the base load usage level over the course of the day, the block period total usage level during both the pre-peak and peak hours of the day, as well as the variability in load shape across days, and finally the variability in usage across days during the post-peak hours. So now we can take those 5 characteristics that were found to be important for separating households into these 9 groups, and we can show how those 9 groups differ from each other across those characteristics. So we thought a heat map might actually be the easiest way to compare and contrast those different characteristics across the 9 groups. So to simplify, we labeled our 9 groups with super creative names. You can see at the top, A through I. On the left side are those 5 specific characteristics that meaningfully defined and differentiated our 9 customer groups. And the heat map itself shows for each characteristic the minimum value in yellow and the maximum value in red across the 9 customer cluster groups. Where a customer group has a value for a particular metric between those 2 extremes for that characteristic, it's represented by some shading of the color orange. So looking at variability in load shapes across time, the majority of our 9 customer groups consistently have a high degree of variability from day to day in their patterns of electricity consumption. We can see this because the colors are shifted more towards the red end of the spectrum than the yellow end. However, it's only groups F and I that appear to have relatively more stable usage levels, represented by the stark yellow color. We also see a bit more variation away from the extremes across our customer groups concerning the variability of their day-to-day average usage levels during the 2 hours just after the peak period. There's considerably more shades of orange than red or yellow here, although clearly groups A and C have very high degrees of variability on a day-to-day basis in the post-peak hours, whereas groups H and I have very modest variability then. For the 3 remaining characteristics, we see very similar patterns represented in terms of relative differences across the various groups. Right? For example, group I has the greatest average peak period and pre-peak period usage, as well as customer use, baseload usage, In contrast, group C has the lowest levels for these same 3 characteristics. And in general, the other groups have very similar magnitude or same relative magnitude of each of these 3 characteristics, as you can see from consistent coloring. So now that we've got a sense of how these 9 customer groups differ from each other based on these 5 characteristics, we can begin to think about what these characteristics as well as their levels might suggest about which customer groups a utility would want to target market to for a particular rate or program offering. For example, customers with larger levels of load at key points in the day may be able to more easily alter their usage in response to a rate or program, but they also might be able to more easily provide a larger response. In either case, such customers with higher savings potential might be much less load. In addition, customers who have minimal base load conceivably have much more load coming from end uses that intermittently consume electricity at different points in the day at the customer's discretion. And so this suggests that customers with low base load may actually have more opportunities to control their usage in response to a rate or program than customers who have larger amounts of base load. Last but not least, we also have the ability to derive additional metrics that might be helpful for identifying who to target market to. For example, we could apply the load shapes of customers in a given group to both their existing rate as well as a rate that we're thinking about, let's say a TOU rate. So with the two different bills in hand, we can average the difference between them across all of our customers in each of the 9 groups. And this will enable us to quantify how financially better or worse off each group of customers as a whole would be had they taken service under this hypothetical TOU rate instead of their existing background rate. Now this metric represents the degree of what we're calling structural winningness. I'm not quite sure that's a word, but you get the point. In the event a customer is actually worse off financially from taking service on the TOU rate, well, this would be represented as a negative structural winningness. So we would assume that customer groups who have the highest degree of structural winningness would be the most inclined to participate in the TOU rate, as they would see a reduction in their bill without having to necessarily respond at all. Interestingly, and to provide you with yet another teaser for our 3rd webinar, our research found that customers with some of the highest levels of structural winningness actually provide some of the largest response levels to a TOU rate. So just because a customer can benefit financially by simply joining the rate doesn't mean that they will fail to subsequently act in response to that rate. So again, tune in 2 weeks from now to hear this great next chapter in our scintillating research saga. So using the existing customer groups and elements from the 2 different rates, we can construct this new metric representing structural winningness and add it to our heat map. Now you can see from the graphic that customers in group I have the highest degree of structural winningness, indicating that they would see the largest aggregate bill savings of our customer cluster groups from simply moving towards the TOU rate. Alternatively, customers in group E would see the least amount of structural winningness, suggesting they would likely need to undertake more substantial changes in their consumption patterns to capture any associated bill changes. However, that's not to say that customers in group E would necessarily dislike the rate once they got on it. Again, in this case, prior research of ours showed that customers who fell into this category, counterintuitively, they were the most motivated to undertake changes in their consumption patterns, but were also generally willing to continue taking service under such a rate despite the negative bill impacts they had experienced. Now we hypothesize that the opportunity to exert more control over their bill by simply altering the timing of when they use electricity produced a greater satisfaction for those customers than simply being told and trying to just use less overall, which is really the only way to make your bill less on a flat rate. So now that we've sort of characterized the heat map on a row-by-row basis, let's do it on a column-by-column basis to see to better assess which groups a utility might want to more vigorously target market this TOU rate to. So for example, we can see that customer group I has the highest degree of savings potential by way of peak and pre-peak period usage levels. And they also have the largest degree of structural winners. A utility might be wise to specifically target customers from group I for their TOU rate offering. Excuse me. Now, if customers who are highly stable in their usage patterns and peak period consumption are willing and able to make one-time changes in their routines in order to adapt to the TOU rate, then a utility has even more reason to aggressively market their TOU rate to households in group I. We can also see that we can also use this information to assess who might be a poor candidate for our hypothetical TOU rate. Folks in in group A have some of the lowest savings potential among the customer groups, as evidenced by more modest peak, pre-peak, and baseload usage levels. In addition, customers in this group, for them to potentially see bill savings, they would need to alter their consumption patterns. And so efforts might be even more challenging if the high degree of variability over time in both these customers' daily load profiles and post-peak period consumption levels limits their interest and ability to adapt to the TOU rate. So when taken all together, a utility might decide to avoid marketing to these customers entirely.
And Pete, I'm just going to jump in. I think Pete is almost done with his presentation, but it looks like we are probably not going to have time to answer a question, and so it's actually a non-question and answer session, unless you want to stay on afterwards, which we will. But feel free to either put all your questions down in the chat box, and we will sort of answer them, and I think probably post them somewhere, or feel free to email us with questions, and we might do a separate Q&A question later. Okay, 2 more minutes.
All right, thanks, Annika, for the reminder. Okay, so but now for the cliffhanger, right? We just posed that we might want to target Group I for TOU and avoid Group A entirely, but are we right? Would targeting these 2 groups in this way actually lead to better program outcomes? Dun, dun, dun. In the next episode, we'll find out the truth. The ground truth, that is, of whether our ideas about how to target would actually result in better outcomes. So in summary, look, there's really a whole host of uses and applications for smart meter data, of which analytics are really just one. We've illustrated, hopefully, how the development of some more complex metrics that capture characteristics of customer load shapes can be used to group customers together who share those characteristics. Not only does this help a utility better understand its customers, but we showed how it could also be used to identify customer groups who might be more or less successful on some rate or program offering. And so as I've repeatedly mentioned throughout the presentation, in our next webinar, we will apply these same load shape characteristics and customer segmentation analytical techniques to an actual utility rate offering. And this creates a really great opportunity to compare and contrast actual participation decisions and performance levels of customer groups across these load shape characteristics. Such tangible applications of the methods described in this webinar should help further illustrate the value to a utility from performing these types of analyses on customers currently taking service under some rate or participating in some program to help inform going forward efforts. Yeah, so it looks like we're just the top of the hour. I'm fine sticking around for another 5 minutes or so to answer just a few of the questions that we get, Annika, if that's kosher with you.
Yeah, that definitely works for me. And then, like I said, you guys just put any questions you have in the question chat box, and we're going to get them. And then feel free to email one or both of us. And yeah, and hopefully we will have more time in the next webinar or the one after that to maybe just have a bigger discussion about questions. So.